So good afternoon, everyone watching this. This is Jeff Payne from the NESA Center with the, I don't know what number we're on, but as part of our IOR Digital Series. We are incredibly pleased, and honestly I have to admit it is long overdue, to be joined today by Nilanthi Samaranayake, who is a leading analyst at Cna, which is a research institution located here in Washington, D.C., but does research, among many things, on the maritime domain. Nilanthi's expertise specifically is the Indian Ocean region. She is one of the leading voices examining the way the region is changing and how that matters for the U.S. Navy, the tri-services, as well as regional navies, coast guards, and so forth. So she joins us today to give some of her insights based on research, and we are pleased to have her here today. So Nilanthi, to jump right into the conversation, I'm going to start with a general question that seems easy but allows you to go down the labyrinth craziness of the various strategies relating to the United States government. What do you see right now as the key priorities for the U.S. government in the Indian Ocean region as it relates to the maritime domain specifically?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Jeff, for having me, and I appreciate the opportunity to share some of my personal research and views on the Indian Ocean region. Yeah, as you said, it's really a dynamic region that is receiving a lot of increased attention these days. So in terms of the U.S., I think we've seen really over the past decade just an intensification of interest in the Indian Ocean region. I think historically it's been really a region that often folks kind of overlook, or is sort of a region for transiting through, really from going from one exciting region to another exciting region, like the Middle East. You pass through the Indian Ocean sea lanes and you get to another exciting region like the South China Sea or the Pacific. So I think there's often been really a sort of a highway metaphor at work when people actually thought about the Indian Ocean, if at all. But now there's been a lot of increased policy attention toward it. So I think India has been one of those drivers behind it, and essentially the U.S. government's interest in demonstrating to India the increased importance that it has in terms of being a strategic partner to the United States. So I think that's part of it. And you asked about the maritime domain. I think essentially it seems to me really been a matter of U.S. policy effort that transcends administrations, but really to cultivate India as a strategic partner, and especially with leadership in the maritime domain. So as you're talking about the Indian Ocean region and specifically maritime missions and activities, I think that's really been an interest of the U.S. government over the past 2 decades, really, but in the last 10 years, I would say there's been a real intensified focus on the Indian Ocean specifically, but really trying to get India to demonstrate greater leadership and activities in the Indian Ocean region, which I think it certainly has been doing.
Thank you, Nilanthi. I do not disagree with your points, especially about India. And I appreciate you making those, because honestly, there is a habit here in Washington to make all things about China, which I think for those who have always been interested in the Indian Ocean region, it is much more a dynamic and much more vital region than just vis-a-vis great power competition. So let's switch gears. Let's toss out U.S. opinions, U.S. viewpoints, U.S. approaches, because this region is dynamic in its own right, regardless of any outside actor. And look specifically on the feature of Indian Ocean island states. This is something that comes up in your research that you have written on extensively. These island states are not uniform, but they seem to share a similar kind of strategic challenge. And what is that challenge as you see it? Like what are the sort of hurdles that they have to leap, linkages they have to develop, and approaches they have to adopt?
That's a great question, Jeff. Yeah, it's really interesting because you see attention to these Indian Ocean island states. It really, all of a sudden, the attention will just ramp up depending on a particular development or an election in one of these countries, and then just kind of go back to almost nothing, you know. So it's kind of interesting. So to me, it suggests, like you said, great power competition. That's really been the focus. So now, whether it's called long-term strategic competition or whatnot, the point is that there's been so much attention, like you said, on China or Russia and the U.S. and these great power interactions. But I think when this interest and very sometimes intense interest in some of these small island states comes up, to me it suggests maybe a deeper lack of understanding or insufficient understanding about small states. And I think collectively, you can really think about small states globally and across different regions. But since we're talking about the Indian Ocean region, I think there hasn't been as much policy attention or really enough academic understanding about about small states in the Indian Ocean region or like South Asia or pick your region generally, in terms of what are some of the drivers for small states policy decisions. I think you look at a lot of international relations theory, for example, and a lot of it leans heavily on the decisions made by great powers or major powers. So I think on a theoretical level or conceptual level, it really it kind of speaks to our lack of deep understanding about what drives small states generally. And then I think when we're talking about the Indian Ocean region, you know, we're focused on, you know, what's this new thing that China and Sri Lanka are doing, or what's Mauritius's fight against the UK sovereignty claim on the Chagos and the implications for U.S. military basing in Diego Garcia. So you can kind of work down tactically to the individual issues at hand, but I think it represents a deeper conceptual insufficient understanding about what drives really small states and the dynamics at that level.
Well, I could keep asking you to flesh that out, but you did breach kind of one of the big things, and that is the territorial dispute between Mauritius and the United Kingdom over the Chagos archipelago, and then how that impacts the U.S. Base at Diego Garcia. This is talked about a lot in the media. There's never a comprehensive picture put in place. It's always alluding to other articles that give you a little piece of the pie. So what's going on? First off, let's start with that, and then what do you think this is all leading to? If you had to speculate within boundaries, what is your speculation on this?
It's a very complex issue. So essentially, this goes back to the process of decolonization that Mauritius went through, and effectively the UK claims the Chagos Islands, this archipelago in the Indian Ocean, and their claim goes back to the 1800s. And then you have Mauritius and its pursuit of independence several decades ago, and essentially Mauritius has been waging this international legal campaign, this international diplomatic campaign, and has really been racking up a lot of victories in various forums, the International Court of Justice, most recently the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, the special chamber there. And then also at the UN, the General Assembly. So really international legal forums, international diplomatic forums, where Mauritius has been winning, which is interesting, getting back to the issue of small states, the fact that you can have a small state actually be so successful in these types of international forums. But effectively, it's a dispute over the Chagos Islands and essentially who should own those islands, Mauritius or the UK. And you see this gradual really chipping away that Mauritius has pursued in terms of the UK's claim. So like one tangible differences. We all got used to seeing a British Indian Ocean territory for much of our lives, and now, like, you look at the UN world map, it's not there. It has Chagos and it has Mauritius right next to it. So that there are some of these developments that are really helping to erode the UK's claim on those islands. But in terms of what's going on the ground is, well, we're not seeing the UK lead. So it gets to this issue of the role of international law and international diplomacy versus sort of international, what countries' military forces do, and actual ownership of territory. So this is what we're seeing. We're really in that process, and as analysts observing these developments. So it's really been very active in the last few years, for sure, but maybe in the last six years of really just a lot of developments happening between Mauritius and the UK on this dispute.
To follow up with that, on the issue of Diego Garcia itself, for the U.S. point of view, without getting into, obviously, decisions will eventually have to be made one way or the other by the United States, but what are the options for the U.S. right now? I think that's something that still remains largely misunderstood, that in this dispute over the status of Chagos, Diego Garcia is one of such islands. Would siding with Mauritius's claim make us depart from Diego Garcia? If we sided with UK, would that be in violation in the same way the United Kingdom is? What are the option sets for the United States right now when it comes to the status of that base?
That's a really good question, Jeff. So right now, the status quo is that the U.S. got an extension on its agreement with the UK for access to the base, essentially running now through the year 2036. So it's, there's a bit of time that remains, although, one could argue, 15 years can go by just like that. But at least the status quo is that's that. And then in terms of policy statements, the US government has essentially backed the UK's claim on sovereignty to the Chagos. So, like you've seen a statement come out from the State Department, for example, and also at the UN General Assembly in the resolution in 2019. So that's the US position right now. Interestingly, though, we held an event at CNA, and we invited Mauritius's ambassador to the UN to speak, to share his thoughts on the issue. And he actually mentioned that his government is open to offering the US a 99-year lease on the base, so on a bilateral basis. And I think he spoke about potentially a trilateral agreement with the UK, but we actually wrote up an event report on that event, and it's on our website if you actually want to see his remarks. But that was a really interesting takeaway, that Mauritius is actually open to the idea of just concluding, I think from a U.S. perspective, just kind of a normal or standard traditional bilateral basing agreement, not necessarily going through the UK. So that seems to be one option, at least. But of course, the other option is just keeping things the same, essentially the status quo. And there's an alliance management dimension for the US to back its, arguably one of its closest allies, the UK. So that's another option to keep things the status quo. And then perhaps trilaterally could be a third option, where the US, UK, and Mauritius work together. So those are three options that come to mind. But clearly it's a very complicated issue. There's also the issue of the Chagosians, so where this issue of human rights intersects with issues of strategy and military forces. And there's also the global posture review that is taking place right now, that the Pentagon has discussed in its press releases. So that could be potentially another option for it, essentially dealing with a lot of these intersecting issues as well. So just yeah, a lot of issues at work and important decisions that need to be made by policymakers.
Well, the report you mentioned from CNA, if you send me the link, I'll make sure that it's embedded in the video itself, so that encourage people to view it. But we'll take care of that after this. All right, switching gears again. I mean, one, you've made my head hurt a little bit talking about Diego Garcia, which I think is kind of the point. It's a very, very complex set of overlapping issues. But switching gears a little bit, you've also written extensively about Sri Lanka. And Sri Lanka is an interesting case. I've seen you speak at the Gaul Dialogue in Colombo. It's not in Gaul anymore, which is odd, but
and you spoke there as well.
Right. But the issue is with Sri Lanka is everyone talks about why it's important. There's a lot of analysts who in the United States who say Sri Lanka is key. A lot of Indian strategists say Sri Lanka is key. Obviously, the Chinese are very interested in Sri Lanka. It's really, really important. How is Sri Lanka navigating this intensified attention by major actors, both regionally and non-regionally? And then, what is the renewed interest in Sri Lanka? I've heard different arguments. I've heard that it's because the civil war, the distance between with the civil war is greater enough now that countries are more comfortable engaging. Second, there's a lot of economic prospects with the island. But third is where it's located. It's just a geostrategic bullseye, and so everyone's fixating on it. What are your thoughts there? Again, not an easy set of questions to navigate, but sorry, that's the task you have.
Yeah, it's interesting because Sri Lanka, I think it depends who you ask, because I guess just everybody's been looking at it or studying the issue for various amounts of time. So I think from my perspective, like it doesn't seem like it's necessarily a new issue, and then there are people who've been studying it a lot longer than I have, and they've kind of seen the trajectory of interest in it. From my perspective, attention to it seems to come up like with national elections, for example, or when some deal with China comes up. But otherwise, it usually attention to it is pretty dormant, which I think kind of reflects a deeper lack of understanding about the dynamics in terms of that country's foreign policy. And I think you can think about it more broadly, like you mentioned Sri Lanka's location, but Maldives, is also located along the sea lanes and also doesn't get a ton of attention until there's some big event. So I think just now, of course, China seems to get everybody interested in a lot of issues related to the Indian Ocean. So that's a driver, I think, of increased attention to Sri Lanka. But like in the 1980s, U.S. relations with Sri Lanka drove a lot of attention to Sri Lanka, by analysts. So I think it's when you have a great power and especially an extra-regional power, having some kind of interaction with one of these smaller Indian Ocean countries, it tends to generate a lot more interest and attention to, what's exactly going on in that country, and what's the foreign policy calculus of that country. So I think that might be part of it. As you mentioned, Sri Lanka's location, that certainly seems to be another driver of interest, although I do think China is often the catalyst to a lot of those discussions. But I don't know if this was for the same Gaul Dialogue event that where you and I were, but I remember Admiral Harris in his comments and speaking at the Gaul Dialogue, he talked about Sri Lanka's location, and he really emphasized Sri Lanka's location. So you could tell as a analytical variable for him that was or certainly a driver of his interest as PACOM commander at the time. So I think location is part of it, but then also, as you talked about, rightfully so, development is another part of it. You hear a lot about how South Asia is one of the least integrated regions in the world, so therefore there are a lot of prospects for developing infrastructure and greater connectivity, and I think you could say that about other countries in the Indian Ocean region as well. And just when you look at some of the trade numbers, how a lot of commerce that actually takes place in the Indian Ocean region, it's often destined for regions outside the Indian Ocean. So really speaking to the global importance of that region, but also it suggests that more development and infrastructure could take place within the region as well. So I think it suggests more development possibilities within Sri Lanka. Certainly, its aspirations to become a maritime shipping hub is important. And then, of course, you enter China and the Belt and Road Initiative, and how much of that is focused on infrastructure development and some of these infrastructure wars or infrastructure competition that we're seeing between China and India and Japan. So there are a lot of different drivers, I think, to that interest in countries like Sri Lanka, like you mentioned.
That's well said, Nilanthi. I mean, honestly, everyone gives a lot of attention to Hambantota, which I actually think the attention should be fixated on Colombo port itself, which is going through a massive redevelopment phase. Chinese money is present, but also Japanese, Indian dual financing projects. I mean, that is clearly where the impetus politically by Sri Lanka is on the Colombo port. But before I move on to another question, I want to give the opportunity to anyone joining us to jump in with a question. So if you want to jump in with a question to Nilanthi, just raise your hand. But I'll give us, okay, Anne, I will turn it over to you, Anne Moisan.
And I really appreciated your overview. It was very nice. The one thing is fact that, it's almost the U.S. is kind of it appears to be in a win-win situation as far as Diego Garcia is concerned. Is fact that, if you put politics aside, there is truly a benefit for the country, Mauritius, to keep the U.S. there because of the budget itself. Okay, the amount of money that is spent on that particular island is really tremendous. But on the flip side of that, I remember even when I was there, they have a very, very shallow water aquifer. There are lots of resource problems when you have a population, even with just the military population on that island to support that without having to import water. I mean, there were lots and lots of issues, okay, on the island. And I know that even with the British representative, when he and I chatted when I was there, and admittedly it was a number of years ago, it was always this very tenuous balance between resources and population on the island. So much so that they would not even bring in other Americans on the island in order to keep a very low ceiling, okay, the number of people that were actually physically on the island because of the resources, and it was usually water driven than anything else.
That's really fascinating, Anne. Just to hear anybody's time spent operating in Diego Garcia really sheds a lot of insight for analysts like myself, and that's really interesting. I was thinking about Andaman and Nicobar Islands that are owned by India. You hear sort of a similar issue about just in terms of not exactly welcoming people to visit the islands itself, at least in the Andaman and Nicobar case, due to the delicate ecology and some of the tribal populations based there. So that's really interesting to hear, Anne, what you were talking about, sort of an aversion to even having Americans come to Diego Garcia and the need for fresh water.
Certainly, and it gets to the issue of the issue of the population, the Chagos people themselves. I mean, that's and that's a real world data set that actually is key, that I think gets lost in a lot of these political debates over it. Not to bring to put away the politics of the Indian Ocean region, which it's a massive region. It's incredibly fascinating. I know it's driven you a little bit mad for the time you've been an analyst, as it has me. But one of the things that we try to do here in this series is we bring together people who focus on either a component part or specific aspect or the comprehensive whole of the Indian Ocean region. And then ask them, where do you see the future? And I'd like to kind of end this conversation with that question. What are the trend lines as you see them going forward? What are the challenges that are on the horizon that people are not paying attention to? What are the opportunities that people may be ignoring? And so I will turn that to you so you can be our Nostradamus of Monday.
Thank you, Jeff. Looking into my crystal ball, that's a great question. Really, just thinking about possible futures. I'm always struck by like looking back at some of the books and the articles from like the 90s and essentially the omission of China and the role that it would eventually come to play in the Indian Ocean. So you try to think backward and what were some of the drivers to China's presence in the region, and you think to the counter-piracy deployments and how Somali piracy, how one of the outcomes to that very non-traditional security issue set could result in this really traditional security dynamic in the Indian Ocean. So like you said, it's just a fascinating region to study. I guess, right, trying to look forward, I think, right, China, there were a lot of observers who focused on the Chinese submarine when it came into the Indian Ocean region and paid port call. So extrapolating there, I think we should think about when the Chinese aircraft carrier comes into the region and does it sail, and just thinking about what will that look like? What will the media look like? What will some of the pressure be on policymakers as a result? So that's just one issue. But I'm thinking more broadly as well, just in thinking about the overall balance of Chinese projects and versus Indian and Japanese projects. India and Japan, they've talked about this Asia-Africa growth corridor. So whether that will materialize or have some real tangible fruit, that's still a question in my mind. So I think that's one level of analysis. The other is really when we're thinking about non-traditional security issues is just the amount of natural disasters that take place in the region. It's something that you can just, it's not a matter of if, but when the next natural disaster will take place. And I think it's important to think about, because it can have a wide-ranging effect, but when it seems very sort of benign or like a non-traditional security issue, we saw with the Quad that the 2004 tsunami, that operating group resulted in this very traditional security outcome with the Quad that we're seeing now with the leaders at the highest level engaging. So I think just thinking about that connection between sort of the when a disaster strikes and that operational coordination, what that could potentially look like in the long run. So I think the fact that the region, you tend to see regular cyclones, and some countries are improving their capacity, but others we're starting to see more, like in the Western Indian Ocean, certainly in some of the African countries like Mozambique. So what does that look like? What does that mean in terms of India's response, for example? India's really made it more of a concerted effort to be more of a response provider, relief provider in the aftermath of natural disasters, and what participation will look like from other countries. Like China wasn't a player in the 2004 tsunami coordination group, but it has a lot greater capabilities now. So what will that look like in the aftermath of a disaster? So that's another area that's worth thinking about. I think we were talking a little bit before about economic development and how there are a lot of opportunities for greater infrastructure in the Indian Ocean region. So I think that's another issue that's important to look at it as the region grows and becomes more prosperous and really goes from sort of lower middle income to potentially even high income someday. Like Mauritius is now high income, so it's different than in some of the South Asian countries. And then one issue that I'm really interested in is the issue of deep seabed mining and what that is going to look like once we see more countries actually going for like exploiting those resources. So far, it's just been at the sort of looking, getting rights and exploring. So I'm interested to see what that could potentially look like. But yeah, like you said, it's really hard to predict some of these issues. So those are some of the questions in my mind right now.
Well, thank you. The deep sea bed mining is. I'll follow up with you on a separate occurrence about that, because honestly, it's not something I know a lot about, but also fascinating. First off, thank you for all of that. I think it's an accurate recognition of the history of the region and how it's unpredictable, and then you're pointing out some of the future trends that you see. Anne, I'll turn it to you real quick for your comment.
All of these islands are scattered. Okay, the distance between them, it's always, people I think underestimate the region, the size of the region, because of the lack of a lot of land mass. But could you talk on the underwater mining was triggered the question. Is there an element of cooperation, something that would draw these countries together and see themselves as a true political, economic, social bloc, where they could, as a group, stand up to larger countries or larger interests where their interests might be much more aligned than, let's say, outside players? Over.
Yeah, Anne, that's a great question. So far, I haven't seen that model take place, but it is interesting to even think of that as a potential model that countries could follow. But it is worth noting that there is the International Seabed Authority. So that at least is a cooperative or governance structure that exists, where you've seen countries with equities on deep seabed mining request and receive rights to actually explore some of these waters, like in the southwest corner of the Indian Ocean. So like South Korea, China, Germany, India. So definitely countries that have interests in the region. But yeah, it is interesting to try to conceive of potentially cooperative models of mining and exploiting some of these resources, as opposed to conflictual models.
Yeah, and that's a great question, and Nilanthi, interesting response. I mean, the one thing I will say to add to Nilanthi, what you put, is that I have noticed just in the past few years a sort of a turning when it comes to security issues. There's increasingly countries in the Indian Ocean region are less interested in capabilities and more about capacities and more about capabilities. Like, listen, we don't need 16 fast attack literal ships. What we need is what we have. We need to be more professional. We need to be more accurate. We need to be more responsive. Whole of society responses, and has run a whole series of programs on this throughout Africa. But the issues of littoral security require you to integrate the viewpoints of coastal communities. And so this is something that people are starting to turn the angle on. And then the final thing I would add, just returning to an earlier point you made about the region being far more than just a highway, a transit economic corridor. And that is, it's amazing to think about the fact of the sheer number of bilateral trade the U.S. has with Indian Ocean rim countries. It's kind of like one of the unheralded stories, as you well know. But that, if you exclude Japan, the Indian Ocean rim supersedes the Pacific, and that includes throwing in Chinese numbers when it comes to foreign direct investment, back and forth. And so I find that to be a fascinating figure that belies the lack of focus on the Indian Ocean region itself. So, but with that, this was a great conversation. We covered a great deal of ground. I could keep you for another 3 or 4 hours, and we wouldn't even scratch the surface. So we'll have you back. NESA will never let you go. Once you've accepted an invitation, you are in our mafia, so to speak. So thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your expertise. And we will be in touch soon. But until then, take care of yourself and stay safe.